I never thought ordering takeout could get me killed. That's the thought that keeps replaying in my head every time I remember what happened that Friday night. The night that turned a simple Uber Eats delivery into the kind of real-life horror story that haunts you long after the food's gone cold. I'm 18. I live alone about 8 miles outside of town, and I've always felt safe enough in my little apartment with my tiny 5-pound Maury dog as my only roommate. But nothing could have prepared me for how one delivery would flip my entire reality upside down. People love to watch true scary stories and creepy encounters online thinking it'll never happen to them. But I'm here to tell you that Uber horror isn't just a headline it can knock on your window in the middle of the night when you least expect it. It started out as a normal evening cleaning my place, getting ready for my long-distance boyfriend to visit over the weekend, feeling hungry and not wanting to dirty my freshly cleaned kitchen. So I did what so many of us do. I picked up my phone and ordered some food thinking it was the safest thing in the world. I had no idea that the man delivering my dinner was about to become the monster standing outside my window, proving that sometimes your worst rideshare nightmare doesn't come from the ride. It comes from the guy who's supposed to drop off your meal and disappear. If you've ever trusted a stranger to leave your food at your door, buckle up, because this is one Uber horror story that might make you question every knock you hear in the dark. I remember standing in my kitchen that Friday night, wiping down the counters, feeling that quiet satisfaction you only get after cleaning your place top to bottom. And I was counting the hours until my boyfriend arrived the next day, imagining how perfect everything would be, how I'd finally get to spend time with him after weeks apart. But somewhere between scrubbing the sink and folding laundry, my stomach reminded me I hadn't eaten. And there was no way I was messing up the kitchen I'd just made spotless, so I grabbed my phone and opened the Uber Eats app, the glow of the screen reflecting in the dark window like a second set of eyes watching me. And I guess that should have been my first sign that this wasn't just another ordinary night, because even though I'd heard a few Uber horror stories online, I'd never really believed anything like that could happen to me. And so without giving it much thought, I scrolled through the menu, picked a place, and placed my order, not realizing I'd just hit the first domino in a chain of events that would push me into my own personal true scary story. The kind of creepy encounter people whisper about in rideshare nightmare forums, and think is just internet fiction until it happens to them. And as soon as the confirmation buzzed on my phone, I noticed the driver assigned to my order was a man named Jacob, driving a white Honda Fit Sport, which sounded completely harmless, just another normal driver, except something about the way the photo on his profile was slightly blurry made a cold shiver crawl up my spine, like he didn't want his face seen clearly, but I brushed it off because I told myself I was being paranoid. And anyway, I'd left delivery instructions in the app to leave it at the door because I was home alone, and liked the idea of not having to talk to strangers face to face, and for a few minutes after I placed the order, everything felt fine. The TV was on low, my dog was curled up on the couch, and it seemed like nothing could go wrong until my app chimed again and showed me Jacob was already pulling into my complex way faster than I expected, which struck me as odd because the restaurant wasn't even that close. And that tiny flickering feeling of unease started to flare up in the back of my mind, a creeping thought that maybe this was how those viral Uber horror stories started. But I still told myself it was probably nothing. And as I peeked through my blinds waiting for him to leave my food, I had no idea that the next knock on my door wouldn't be from Jacob, but from someone who'd changed the entire trajectory of my night. And that's when my neighbor showed up holding my dinner eyes wide with something that told me this wasn't going to be the quiet Friday evening I'd planned. When I heard the knock at my door, I jumped a little because my app had already told me my food was delivered. And instinctively I expected to open the door and see a brown paper bag sitting on my doormat. But instead, when I pulled the door open, there stood my next-door neighbor holding my Uber Eats order in both hands like it was radioactive, his eyes darting nervously down the hallway and then back to me, and I blinked at him confused because it felt like my brain couldn't quite process why he was standing there instead of my delivery driver, until he leaned closer and said in a low voice, "Hey, sorry I picked up your food from your delivery driver because he was looking through your windows and I wasn't sure what he was doing, and for a second it was like the entire world tilted sideways because the words didn't make sense, and the image of someone outside my apartment peering through my windows made the hair on my arm stand up like static. And I took the bag from my neighbor with shaking fingers, mumbling thanks, but the whole time my stomach was flipping over because 1,000 thoughts were colliding in my head, like how long had the driver been standing there, and what exactly had he seen? And why the hell would a stranger be looking into my apartment? And while my neighbor tried to reassure me, it was probably nothing. His eyes said otherwise, eyes that kept scanning the hallway like he was expecting the driver to suddenly appear out of the shadows. And even as I shut my door and locked it tight, my heart was still hammering so hard that my tiny 5-pound dog started barking at me like he could sense the fear pouring off me. And I sat down on the couch and opened my food, trying to convince myself everything was fine. Telling myself this wasn't one of those creepy encounters I'd listened to on YouTube at 2 in the morning, because this was real life and stuff like this wasn't supposed to happen. But the taste of the food was suddenly bitter in my mouth, and every little noise outside made me jerk my head toward the window, expecting to see a face staring back. Because now the shadows seemed to move differently, and I couldn't stop wondering if I'd just become the main character in my own uber horror story, one that belonged on the same playlists as all those true scary stories and rideshare nightmare videos. And even though I tried to calm down and focus on my movie, there was a part of me that kept replaying my neighbor's words over and over, until they felt carved into my skull. And deep down, I knew that the night wasn't over, not by a long shot, and the real horror was still waiting just outside my window, ready to crawl in when I least expected it. Even after I finished eating, I couldn't shake the feeling that there were eyes on me from somewhere just beyond the edges of the darkened windows, and every time I tried to focus on my movie, my mind kept flicking back to the way my neighbor's voice trembled when he told me the Uber driver had been looking through my windows, and the thought burrowed into my brain like a splinter I couldn't pull out, making it impossible to relax, because all I could think about was how many times I'd sat in this apartment assuming I was safe, completely unaware that someone might be watching me from the shadows. And even though my tiny 5-pound Maury dog had finally curled up in his usual spot on the couch, he kept raising his head and letting out these low growls that vibrated through his tiny chest. His eyes locked on the back door like he could see something I couldn't. And the more I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, the more I realized how quiet the apartment felt. How even the hum of the refrigerator seemed too loud, and every creak in the walls made my heart skip a beat. Because this wasn't just a random story on a creepy encounters thread anymore. This was real happening to me. And as the hours dragged by, I found myself glancing at the clock over and over, my nerves winding tighter. Every time my dog's growling rose into a sharp bark, until around 2 o'clock in the morning, I was jolted awake by the sound of loud banging against my window. A sound so sudden and violent that for a second I couldn't even move, frozen under my covers, with my breath stuck in my throat. And my dog went absolutely ballistic, barking and growling and even whimpering, like he couldn't decide whether to protect me or hide. And I felt the blood drain out of my face, because the banging kept coming steady and deliberate, not random like tree branches in the wind. And I strained my ears and could swear. I heard a man's harsh breathing between the thuds. And every horror story I'd ever listened to on YouTube about Uber horror and rideshare nightmare scenarios flashed through my mind like a montage of warnings I should have taken more seriously. But nothing could have prepared me for how paralyzed I felt in that moment. Because it was one thing to hear about true scary stories in someone else's voice, and another to realize I was living one. And as I peeked out from under my blankets, my eyes locked onto the silhouette of someone standing just outside the window, motionless except for the way their head seemed to tilt slightly, like they were trying to see in. And even though my rational brain screamed at me to move, to run, to call for help, I couldn't help feeling like if I so much as breathed too loudly, whatever was on the other side of that glass would come crashing through, and I knew that hiding under my blanket wasn't going to save me if whoever was out there decided to force their way in. And that's when I realized I needed to make a choice. Either keep pretending this was just another creepy encounter I could brush off in the morning, or finally accept that my night was about to turn into the kind of uber horror story that nobody ever wants to star in. And so with my heart hammering, I reached for my phone because I knew I had to call for help, no matter how terrified I was of what might happen next. My fingers were trembling so badly I could barely unlock my phone screen, and it took me 3 tries before I finally managed to dial 911. My voice coming out in a cracked whisper, as I tried to explain to the dispatcher that there was someone banging on my window in the middle of the night. And I kept glancing over my shoulder like I expected a face to suddenly appear behind me. Because even though I'd listened to countless true scary stories and uber horror narrations online, nothing ever truly captures the icy weight that slams into your chest when you realize the nightmare is happening to you. And as I gave the dispatcher my address, I felt like I was drowning in fear. My breaths coming out in shallow gasps, and I could hear my dog still barking and whimpering like he was trying to warn me that this was more than just a random creepy encounter. And the woman on the other end of the line kept telling me to stay calm and move to another room. But every step felt like my legs were made of concrete, because my brain was screaming at me that if I moved too fast, whoever was outside might hear me and come crashing through the glass. And I kept picturing hands smashing the window open, reaching for me, pulling me out into the cold darkness. And the more I tried to quiet my breathing, the louder the banging seemed to grow, each knock echoing through the apartment like gunshots, and it felt like my walls were closing in around me, trapping me in a tiny box of terror. And my mind kept flashing back to my neighbor's face when he told me the driver was looking through my windows earlier, and I realized that the line between rideshare nightmare videos and real life had completely vanished, because this wasn't just a scary story for entertainment anymore. This was me in my own personal horror movie, and I could feel the sweat running down my spine, even though the room felt freezing cold. And as I huddled in my kitchen, clutching a kitchen knife with my free hand, I kept thinking that I'd never look at Uber Eats the same way again, because the idea that a stranger with access to my name and my address might be lurking just feet away from me was almost too much to process. And even as the dispatcher assured me the police were on their way, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was outside was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when the banging finally stopped, I felt this momentary wave of relief wash over me. But it lasted all of 2 seconds before I peeked out the side window and saw the faint glow of headlights across the open field beside my building. And my heart dropped into my stomach because I recognized the shape of the white Honda Fit Sport parked out there in the darkness. And in that instant, I knew the night was far from over, and the real terror was only just beginning. I stood there gripping the knife so hard my fingers ached, staring out across that dark, open field as the glow of the white Honda Fit Sport's headlights pulsed faintly through the shadows. And it was like the whole world had shrunk down to that single vehicle parked eerily still with the engine off. And the longer I stared, the more I felt like I could see movement inside, like maybe someone was leaning forward over the steering wheel, watching my apartment from behind tinted glass. And even though part of me kept insisting it could be some random car that just happened to match the Uber drivers, deep down, I knew that wasn't true because my gut was screaming that this was exactly how the scariest Uber horror stories began, the ones where the driver doesn't just drop off your food but decides he wants to see what's inside your house. And as the seconds dragged by, I noticed tiny flashes of light in the car, almost like the glow of a cell phone screen switching on and off. And it made the hair on my arms stand up because I couldn't stop picturing him scrolling through the Uber Eats app, staring at my name, my address, memorizing every detail like a predator stalking its prey. And I felt so exposed standing there in my own kitchen, realizing how easily this guy knew exactly where I lived, what my apartment looked like, how many windows there were. And it was the most helpless feeling I'd ever experienced, worse than any creepy encounter or rideshare nightmare video I'd ever watched on YouTube. Because those stories always happened to someone else, not me. And I tried to tell myself that maybe the police would show up any second and scare him away. But as I watched, the car's headlights flicked off entirely, plunging the field back into darkness so thick it felt like it was pressing against the glass of my window. And for a split second, I thought I saw the faint outline of a person stepping out of the driver's side door. Just a shifting silhouette against the distant glow of a streetlight. And my chest tightened so hard I couldn't breathe, because all I could think was that he was coming back for me, that this wasn't just some harmless glitch in the app, but a real live nightmare unfolding outside my home. And even as I backed away from the window, I could feel every muscle in my body locking up, my brain torn between wanting to hide and wanting to run, and I was shaking so violently I thought I might drop the knife. But just as I was about to dial 911 again, I saw the flash of red and blue lights reflecting off the glass spinning through my dark living room like a sudden burst of hope. And I knew the police had finally arrived. But even then, a small voice in the back of my mind kept whispering that sometimes not even the cops could save you from becoming the next chapter in a true scary story. And I braced myself for whatever was about to happen next. When I saw those red and blue lights dancing across my walls for a split second, I thought everything was going to be okay, like I'd finally crossed the finish line of some twisted marathon and help had arrived. But even as I watched the police cruiser slow roll into the lot, part of me couldn't shake this creeping feeling that it wasn't over, because the white Honda Fit Sport was still sitting out there in the field, silent and dark like a predator waiting for its chance. And the officers didn't even seem to notice it at first, as they stepped out scanning the perimeter with flashlights, and I forced myself to unlock the door, even though my hands felt like they were made of stone because I knew I had to talk to them to tell them that this wasn't just some random creepy encounter, but the kind of real-life Uber horror story you see on True Scary Stories channels. The ones where the victim barely escapes. And as I opened the door, my neighbor was already outside talking to one of the cops, explaining how he'd intercepted my food delivery because the driver was acting weird, staring through my windows like he was casing the place. And I felt a rush of gratitude that he'd even stepped in, because who knows what might have happened if he hadn't. But while the officers were talking, one of them suddenly glanced over my shoulder, his flashlight beam snapping toward the field, and the moment he saw the white Honda, his entire posture changed, like his instincts kicked into high alert, and he motioned for another officer to check it out, while he kept asking me questions, wanting to know exactly what I'd seen and heard, and I was trying to answer. But my voice kept cracking because my mind was stuck on replaying that banging on my window, and how I thought I'd seen someone step out of that car, and I could see the concern tightening the officer's jaw as he listened. And it made my heart pound even harder, because I could tell he believed me. And that almost scared me more, because it meant this wasn't in my head. This was real. A rideshare nightmare unfolding right outside my home. And just as I thought maybe the driver had slipped away into the darkness, the second officer's voice crackled over his radio saying there were footprints leading away from the Honda and around the side of my building, and hearing that made me feel like ice water was coursing through my veins, because it meant the guy had been on foot right up against my home, close enough to touch my windows, and the officer told me to stay inside while they checked around the property. But all I could think was that the walls of my apartment suddenly felt paper thin, and as I watched the cops disappear into the shadows around the side of the building, I knew this wasn't over yet. Because the question clawing at the back of my brain was where exactly the driver was now, and whether he was still waiting for his chance to finish whatever twisted thing he'd come there to do. And that's the thought that followed me as I backed into my living room, trying to convince myself that the worst was behind me, even though deep down I knew the true climax of my Uber horror story was still coming. I was pacing my living room, every creak of the floor sounding like a gunshot in my ears, when the officers finally reappeared from the side of my building, one of them speaking low into his radio, while the other waved me over. And even though my body was screaming at me to stay put, I stepped outside because I needed to know what was happening, and the officer told me they'd found footprints in the mud all around my bedroom window, clear and deep from the rain the night before. And hearing that sent a cold spike of terror through my chest, because it proved without a doubt that whoever had been banging on my window hadn't just been some random passerby, but had been standing there watching me from the shadows close enough to touch the glass. And as I tried to process that my neighbor was talking to the other officer, describing how he'd seen the driver from earlier lurking near my windows, even before he'd grabbed my food, and it hit me how lucky I was that he'd been there. Because if he hadn't intercepted that delivery, who knows how far this creepy encounter might have gone. And the officers said they'd gone to check the white Honda Fit Sport again, and found it empty, but with the keys still in the ignition. And for a second, it was like my entire apartment complex shrank down to just me in that car, sitting like a silent threat in the darkness. And then suddenly one of the officers got a call on his radio, and I saw the muscles in his jaw tighten as he listened. And he turned to me and said they'd just found the driver walking back toward my apartment complex. And my heart dropped into my stomach, because the thought of him coming back after everything made me feel like my skin was crawling right off my bones. And I kept flashing back to every Uber horror video I'd ever watched on YouTube. How so many of those true scary stories end with the person getting caught just in time. And how close I'd come to becoming the next headline in some rideshare nightmare compilation. And the officers told me to stay back as they intercepted him near the edge of the field. And even from my distance I could see the driver's silhouette illuminated by the police flashlights. His posture oddly calm, hands stuffed in the pockets of his hoodie like he wasn't afraid or surprised to be caught. And the most chilling part was when he glanced over the officer's shoulders and locked eyes with me, a slow, unsettling smile curling across his face like he knew a secret no one else did. And though the police quickly moved in to arrest him, I felt a jolt of nausea, because the driver never broke eye contact with me, not even as they pinned his hands behind his back. And as they led him toward the cruiser, he twisted his neck just enough to murmur something I could barely hear, words that would keep me up for weeks afterward. Because in the stillness of that moment, he said, "Next time, I'll bring it inside myself." And it felt like the whole world tilted sideways, because suddenly it wasn't just about delivering food anymore. It was about how close I'd come to having my entire life snatched away by a stranger. And while the officers loaded him into the car, my brain was buzzing with terror and disbelief. And I knew that even though the immediate danger was over, the true horror of that night was going to stay with me forever. And as I backed away from the flashing lights, I realized that no lock or police siren could ever erase the feeling that he might somehow come back, which was a thought that would haunt me long after the car disappeared into the night, leaving me standing alone under the neon glow of my apartment lights, wondering if this was truly the end of my Uber horror story, or just the beginning of something even darker waiting out there in the shadows. Even after the flashing red and blue lights faded into the distance and the officers told me I was safe, I couldn't shake the feeling that my apartment wasn't really mine anymore, because every shadow seemed to crawl closer, and every creak in the walls sounded like footsteps. And as I sat there on my couch with my tiny 5-pound Maury dog trembling in my lap, I realized that the driver's words, "Next time I'll bring it inside myself," were like a curse echoing in my skull, poisoning the very place that used to feel like my safe haven. And while the police assured me he'd been arrested and that I didn't need to worry, I knew deep down that the true horror of this Uber horror story wasn't just about the night itself. It was about how my entire sense of safety had been ripped away in the space of a few hours, and how now I was left wondering if he'd somehow find a way to come back, or if there were other strangers out there watching me from the dark, waiting for their turn. And I kept replaying every second of that night in my mind, from the way my neighbor's voice shook when he handed me my food, to the low growl of my dog that I should have listened to more closely, to the silhouette outside my window that seemed to breathe in time with my own panicked heartbeat. And it dawned on me that it wasn't just a meal that showed up at my doorstep that night. It was the realization that even the smallest interaction, like ordering dinner, can open the door to a nightmare you never saw coming. And now whenever I hear a knock on my door or see the glow of headlights outside my window, a chill runs down my spine, and I wonder if the next person who shows up might be carrying something far more dangerous than a takeout bag. And even though the cops said the danger was over, I know that for me this rideshare nightmare will never really fade. And that's why I stopped using Uber Eats when I'm home alone. Because it's one thing to watch true scary stories or listen to creepy encounters on YouTube, but it's another thing entirely when you become the story yourself. And if you're watching this right now, I want to know, have you ever felt like someone was watching you when you thought you were safe, or had an Uber horror moment that still keeps you awake at night? Drop your story in the comments below, because I read every single one, and if this video gave you chills, don't forget to save it for later, and hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, because believe me, the horror isn't over. And in the next story, we're diving into a ride that went so far off the rails that it makes this one feel like a warm-up. So buckle up for story 4, because things are about to get even darker.